So I wanted to talk today about a little trick that I learned my years studying history. So, as some of you may know, I am a historical scientist, and I often apply this in business and marketing and entrepreneurial efforts. But my main passion is studying history. So, a historical scientist is a little bit different than most people know how historians are defined. Technically, we're historians, but technically, historian just means the storytelling of the historical sciences. So, there used to be historical catalogers, but now those have been replaced by computers. So now most historians are actually data scientists, unless they're just a storyteller, telling the same story over and over. But if you're actually studying history, using it to research and make discoveries that are unknown about the past, then you shouldn't be saying the same thing over and over, or else you're not really studying history, you're just propagating history. So one of the things I like to do is use psychology and social psychology. You've probably seen these applied to things like economics, so behavioral economics, things like marketing, behavioral marketing. I like to do behavioral history. And it's a behavioral analysis of historical context. So the goal here is to go into the social psychological context of the area in question. So this morning I was exploring the social context of the American Industrial Revolution. So that's the one that happened right after the British Industrial Revolution that resulted in, little things like the printing press that made things like America and that experiment even possible. If you're American on the American continents, you probably think that the Industrial Revolution is the American Industrial Revolution because when it comes to machinery and mass production, that's the Industrial Revolution that people care about. But for historical accuracy, let's call this the Second Industrial Revolution, the American Industrial Revolution. Let's go into the context here. So, as many of you know, I'm not an industrialist. I'm quite fascinated by certain games like capitalism and socialism. These are games, they just have higher stakes than things like Fortnite. So things like industrialism, fascism, communism, these are more cult-like beliefs. And this upsets a lot of people to hear this, but they have dogma, they have ideology, they believe their way is the right way. So by an actual factual representation of the details, removing emotion from it, they are all literally cults on a massive scale that somehow collectivize masses of individuals and mold them into like a white hot mass. And this is very dangerous, whether or not it's industrialism, fascism, or communism. Because unlike capitalism or socialism, which we like these things when applied on a small scale, we like socialism in our family unit. We like, you don't want to have to pay, your husband or wife or whatever for sex every single time you want to have a kid. Or every single time you want to, solidify your marriage vows. It's ridiculous to think that, families are anything other than socialists, and that works when it's purely voluntary. And the same thing with capitalism. Capitalism is great when you don't have dictators and rulers telling you how to run your things. That being said, when nobody has the power to tell other people how to run their things, you don't have things like industrialism. So I'm very, very skeptical of industrialism because that's like a modern version of fascism or communism. Industrialism is why in capitalist countries we have things like corporations. Contrary to popular belief, corporate legal structures are not capitalist in nature. They are very, very socialist. In fact, it was the invention of corporations that made communism even possible. So, fun fact about history there. If you get rid of corporations, you get rid of communism. But American industrialists don't tell you that. It's even tough to call them American industrialists now because many of them aren't even headquartered within the U.S. anymore. But industrialism as we know it now really started in the 1800s. So when I was exploring getting back to the whole point of this, when I was exploring the context of industrialists in the 1800s, something really, really interesting happened to me. So I call this time traveling when I move my mind back to the era that I've been studying, and I try and feel what the general people would feel. And this is, you often have points of interest, like if I'm studying industrialism of the 1800s, I'll study Vanderbilt, I'll study Carnegie, I'll study Rockefeller, I'll study Morgan, and I'll study Ford, I'll study, Cook, I'll study all these, big names in the industrial movement. I'll study Westinghouse, I'll study Tesla, I'll study Edison, and I like to go in and not just see what, I guess you could say the playable characters are thinking and feeling, but I'd like to see what the non-playable characters in history, the masses, how they think and feel, what they prefer, what their contexts were. Because in industrialism, voting happens from the customers, that happens from the consumers, it happens from the masses. So everyone is involved. Especially back in that time, everyone had voting rights when it came to buying power. So you get a much better view of the psychological and social sentiments of the time and what certain industrialists believed and what they had to believe to gain traction. And something really, really interesting stood out to me that I had never really tied together. And this came from my understanding of PTSD as we know it now. So PTSD was not, a thing anyone talked about or recognized back in the 1800s. They had names for it, but, it's almost like they were saying, they're just upset. They knew that it was something that popped up in people who had gone to war or experienced war, but it wasn't like PTSD as we know it now. Often they called it the demons of war, and they literally thought that it was like they were inhabited by demons. This is when more people were going to war and coming home surviving more than ever before, and they weren't conscripted for the rest of their lives to be in war. So for the first time ever, people were hearing about the horrors of war in ways that had never been experienced before, because normal people were going to war. And specifically, the war that caught my attention was the Civil War, because this is a war that for American industrialism touched literally everybody's life. Literally everybody had, a family member that died, a child that died, a friend that died, or knew somebody that died, or like their immediate family had a relative or friend that died. So everybody knew somebody that died in this war. That's how massive it was. And that's what happens, something that I think especially people in the United States take for granted. really anyone in North America really takes for granted is that when you're that close to war, it doesn't even matter if you were a soldier. Like, you were affected by the horrors of war in a way that most North Americans, haven't known in generations. And that's crazy to think, even considering that America has like the largest military, or one of the largest militaries, definitely the largest military that's been most active since then. So it's crazy to think that, like, since that was the last war to happen, on our shores, the Civil War and all those battles that preceded it, like, that's really the last one. And what's really, really interesting is every single industrialist had PTSD in some degree. Some of them had it more than others. Like Vanderbilt, he was very, very scarred by that. So there was this new idea that a human could incorporate themselves and have all the perks and privileges of governments. And that is something that, having those organizations and the structure and something people believed in, that's something, unless you were royalty, no one had the option to do anything more than start a business until corporations popped up. And that was something that was very, very important to the American people, was that everyone had access to things like patents and corporations. But then the industrialists, they went through, the Civil War, they came out scarred, and Vanderbilt, he was the first one to start up things like regulatory committees, regulatory administrations, things like the Security and Exchange Commission was because he wanted the government to tax the people to go after the people who were going after him. So he was the first victim of front running. So he wanted to make sure that was illegal because he didn't like that he was so big that he was everyone's target and he wasn't quick enough to stop the people who were front running him. So he got really, really cross and, essentially started the Security and Exchange Commission. And over the years, people like Vanderbilt and Rockefeller all got the same idea. Morgan all got the same idea to start, starting regulation administrations within the government. And these were things that were appointed by the president. So in their context, they got really, really into influencing presidents to assign the people they wanted in these regulation administrations. And that still goes on today. That's why I'm very much against industrialism, even if I'm not against things like capitalism or even small scale socialism in like the family unit, church groups, startups, all practice small scale socialism. And I like the idea of the small business owner, or even medium-sized business owner, but now big business is literally synonymous with industrialism. So I'm very, very skeptical of these things, but I started to, in my time traveling today, going back and trying to meditate on these things, really contemplate this, I started to experience something really, really unusual. And as you can tell, I have a, high level of skepticism for the value of industrialists in the world, in their full context over the past, almost 200 years now. But I had a really, really interesting bout of empathy for them within the past, couple of hours of meditating on this. And I started to realize, well, if these men were all affected by PTSD, as well as many of their wives, really everyone they knew, everything from wives to mistresses to family members, they were all affected by it. Some of them more than others. Like Vanderbilt, he lost a son. And these are things that, push Vanderbilt to the point where he was rushing everything. he cared less and less about other people other than the ones that he kept company with, and that's really dangerous because they didn't have social media like we do now, so you can't really get your hand on the pulse unless you're going out meeting people you don't know. And Vanderbilt had the luxury to be able to avoid strangers and go on living without interacting with strangers. So that created a bubble effect that resulted in him rushing a lot of things, which kept him relevant, but also made him even more cutthroat as time went on. And really, really passed that baton off to Rockefeller, who was very, very close with Vanderbilt until he didn't need him anymore, or really any of the trains anymore, because he started building pipelines, and that's really interesting because he probably wouldn't have done that if Vanderbilt had less of an ego and appeased Rockefeller more, and that Rockefeller innovated and created the pipeline, which is cheaper than trains, but also comes with its own slew of problems. And that resulted in the destruction of Cook's empire, who was the mentor of Carnegie, which created Rockefeller's closest rival with Andrew Carnegie. And you have these chain reactions that happen because Vanderbilt was like trying to rush things. He was trying to become and stay the most powerful person in the world, and that baton of ideology was passed on to Rockefeller. And what's really, really interesting is, Rockefeller, Carnegie, all these people, they were young enough to live through the Civil War, experience the horrors, but not have that personal loss of a child like Vanderbilt. But they still remembered it vividly. I mean, they had family and friends that died. And then towards the end of their life happened World War I. And this is really, really important, because there were a few wars before World War I, and you got to keep in mind that people thought that the wars were getting worse and worse because of the very machines that people like Carnegie and Rockefeller and Morgan and Westinghouse and all these people were able to, create these machines that were resulting in more and more death, but they were taking this context of this very, very brutal war that happened on their doorstep, and they experienced the personal loss, not like on the news, happened in almost another world to people who lose loved ones to war now in Americas, but literally they could find their body on a hill, and that's a whole new level of atrocity. To literally see your family or friends defending the front line, which is your yard, and get gunned down. This is a whole new level of memory that Americans haven't had since the Civil War. And it made me realize, I have nothing but empathy why they wanted to rush things, why they did things the way they did, why they became so obsessed with control and diminishing the power of the masses, because so many people were saying that, especially in things like World War I, the start of World War I, and those types of wars, that it was the masses that were resulting in these new levels of machine warlords that could do massive damage. And the industrialists started to see the masses as the enemy. The people, they had lived long enough to see themselves become the villain, but they were so detached from the masses that their PTSD was triggered near the end of many of their lives, to the point where I realized that the only ones that saw this for what it really was of the early industrialists, was Henry Ford. He didn't live through the Civil War, and he was young enough to be one of those entrepreneurs in a time of peace in America, one of the first entrepreneurs in a time of peace in America where there was not war on our doorstep. And he had a very different outlook than the other industrialists that were in power, that had control over the media. And at the time, the pinnacle of media was the newspaper. And he got labeled a lot of nasty things. And as a historian, you realize, like, media is not history. So you got it's not even taking, historical news with a grain of salt. It's literally, trying to disprove it, to figure out who they were trying to frame. And it's completely evident to historical scientists that Henry Ford was being framed by the people that were more powerful than him, that didn't like his, I guess you could call it, open source ideology. He really believed in sharing the benefits of industrialism with the common man, with essentially the forgotten man, as, people like Hoover and FDR would later on go to address directly the forgotten man, the people who are the non-industrialists, working class. And Henry Ford really, really believed in them, and the industrialists were really, really afraid of them, so they were at odds. And he got called a lot of things that were mostly because he upset bankers like the Morgans, and he was the first one to use offshore banking to fund non-industrial capitalism, but that was later on. So it's really, really interesting to see that a lot of the bad things that exist now, a lot of the bad control and tyranny that happens with industrialism today happened because of the control grab that the most powerful industrialists, the oldest industrialists in the early 1900s had and were able to do because of their capital. And the influence they had was massive in reaction to World War I. And they thought that it was never ending and they were about to die. And they did whatever they could to, protect the world from itself. And we're in an era where we're outgrowing it more than ever. And the only option they have left is to really consider start killing us. And that's a scary thought as a historian, because this happens time and time again with, civilizations that outgrow their rulers. And right now, like, our rulers are not even the people. They're the laws that were created, 100 years ago. And we need to reboot the laws is what we need to do, but that will never happen. So I think the revolution is going to come from within for the first time ever in stuff like the Agile movement, the Agile Manifesto, that kind of stuff, from what I've learned, is already being implemented in non-tech companies and small businesses. Heck, it's even being implemented in governments on a grassroots level, which is very, very fascinating to me. And they are trying very hard. Some of them are trying very hard to get away from that military-industrial complex from within. And that's beautiful. That's why I think, when it comes to facts, they exist, they're simple to understand, and people just have to invest time into them. And that's the disruptive nature of facts. That's the disruptive nature of a good idea. That's exactly what Ford fought for, to make the car a consumer good in a time when it was just a plaything of the rich, and he sold it for less than the patent. Less than the patent royalty fee. Changed the world, changed the way we transported ourselves forever. And I often wonder what the world would have been like if Ford met up with Tesla. And thinking just, these kind of contextual things. Like, there are positive things and there are negative things. And it's not bad to have empathy for your enemy, because once you truly know thy enemy, you truly love thy enemy, you understand thy enemy, and they become powerless against you. And that's a really, really powerful proverb from Sun Tzu, The Art of War. The Art of War is not glorifying war. It's literally talking about the principles of war in a way that will sound very familiar to anybody who studies or cares about things like economics. Because before America really came around, the closest thing we had to economics was war. Like, that was the economic engine up until the rise of capitalism, before the rise of industrialists in the early to mid 1800s. So capitalism rose before industrialism, but they've become almost synonymous now. And that's really important to remember. Like, we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, capitalism is just a game. Socialism is just a game. Like, things like anarchy, pacifism, like liberalism, conservatism, these are lifestyles. But things like capitalism and socialism, these are games. But things like fascism and industrialism, these are ideologies. So you got to keep in mind that, like, ideologies have dogma. And if you have dogma, you're a cult. It doesn't matter if you fit the proper definition of cult, which is conveniently, defined as being small with, a written dogma. No, these dogmas can be written in your heart. Like Rockefeller once said, competition is sin. And that is the industrialist manifesto, is that competition is sin. No self-respecting capitalist that understands the principle of competition is going to suggest that competition is sin. No, they're going to try and beat the competition, but they're not going to try and kill the competition or kill their efforts to compete. That would just be immoral. And yet this is the industrialist way. I think it's very, very important that we have empathy for the people we hate or the people we fear in order to overcome things like hate and fear, which all root from disgust. And it's really about uprooting disgust from our lives. If we can get over that disgust, which is literally that anxiety we feel when we're reading or watching something we don't believe in, that's disgust. That's the root of hate. That's the root of bigotry. That's the root of, bigotry literally means, we reject anyone who thinks different than us. That's like literally the definition of closed-mindedness. There are also certain specific flavors of bigotry, but bigotry itself is so vast and vague that people often discount their own bigotry, because as long as it's not one of those specific flavors like racism or sexism or xenophobia or, mental health stigma, like they think, all right, well, like other types of bigotry, it's so like, no, like if you're a bigot, it's the same thing as being, closed-minded to somebody who thinks different. If you are disgusted by the way somebody thinks to the point where you don't even want to hear it because you just can't even, then, you're a bigot. And that's literally the same thing as being a racist or a sexist. Just keep in mind that before racism and sexism were as bad as they are, they were just like the other types of bigotry. So keep that historical context in mind when we're exploring the people that we want to be better than, and understand that just because we know more doesn't mean that people in the past knew better. And that's really, really important from a historical science perspective. If you're looking at history and you don't know how to answer whether or not they knew what you know now, to feel like you know better, if you don't know that they knew that on a mass scale, and I mean everyone, not just the people in power, but the people who put them in power with their buying power or their voting power. If you don't know whether or not the average person in history knew what you know now, you need to question whether or not you're judging them unfairly just because you know more. And that's really, really important, to not throw the baby out with the bathwater like I see socialists do with capitalism all the time, because they don't learn how to separate, the difference between capitalism and industrialism. And the same thing that capitalists do, throwing baby out with the bathwater by hating socialism like it's the same thing as fascism or communism. I mean, if you're not charging your children for attention, if you're not charging, your wife for sex, whether or not you're straight, gay, or whatever persuasion you are, if you're not charging somebody for your time and attention with friendship or family, you're practicing socialism on that level. So let's keep in mind that there's a difference between socialism and fascism and communism. And let's keep in mind that even communism is one of these things where, like, communism works if it's like a church congregation, but beyond that, no. Like, even that can get dangerous if people are born into it and they feel like they had no other choice. So let's keep in mind that, like, there are certain things that, like, we know work, and there are certain things we don't know, but we trap ourselves into this paradox when we try and throw the baby out with the bathwater, when we don't have empathy for our enemies, and when we don't use when we use divisive language. And that's why, like, I'm really, really interested in studying freeism right now. Mark Nadal, he's a philosopher that works for an organization called ERA. They are an open source organization that, is somewhere between a nonprofit and a for-profit. It's quite beautiful. It's this harmony of, freedom, ideology, technology, and empowering the masses through tools and education. And I love how they work really hard to make sure things don't get overcomplicated just to create an industry, like an expert industry. They try and keep things so simple that everyone can have the same tools to build and compete with the industrialists, whether it's the industrialists in, marketing, technology, construction, government, whatever. And I think it's quite fascinating what they're building over at ERA. You can find ERA at era.eco. That's www.era.eco. So that's era.eco. And highly suggest checking that out. They have a lot of protocols that they're building with fun 3-letter names like Axe and C and Gun, and really, really clever names based on, how powerful they are and what they help people do, whether it's defend themselves, cut through red tape, or whether it's the power of the masses like a C. And these are very, very powerful words that are good if something you like is freedom. So check out freeism, check out what they're doing, especially if you're a developer. Check out the protocols that they're building, because they're building a new internet that will be proverbially free. We can cut out middlemen like internet service providers and have an ad hoc network of the internet. So pretty much every internet-enabled device that has Wi-Fi capabilities, which is pretty much everything now, could be the internet. And what's really, really fascinating is how they're able to do modern miracles like offline internet. Like, that's something it was so mind-boggling to me at first, but I started to realize, it's like the difference between, radio, whether it's AM or FM, the difference between radio and like CB radio, where you have it's not just a receiver, it's a transmitter as well. And they've been able to do this with the internet in a way where, it makes things more cost efficient to run and operate and update a website, because, your visitors help you carry that load to scale. So You don't have to pay more to do more. It's not pay to play. It's really just you pay with time, energy, and attention to get things started, and it can scale infinitely because all of the viewers are carrying that load rather than paying an internet service provider or a hosting provider to help you grow. So it's cutting out that middleman in a way that will prevent the type of censorship we don't want and give us more power to censor the things that we do want to on a personal level, so we don't censor them for other people. So you can censor things like, the dark web. You don't have to rely on government or, internet service providers to censor it. You can censor it from the internet you experience or your family experiences all by yourself. And it's very, very easy, like user settings on, the easiest user settings you've ever seen, and that's really, really amazing. You don't have to ask somebody else to protect yourself or your family from things that you deem immoral, and yet other people can't do the same thing to you, and that's freedom in a nutshell. So I love it. So once again, check out ERA. That's era.eco, www.era.eco. And check out their other protocols. And just a heads up, if you're into things like blockchain and cryptocurrency, this is not a currency. It is not a blockchain, but it is decentralized. So anybody that understands things like freedom and republics and the power of being able to start your own business or start your own group of friends or start your own family. This doesn't have anything to do with an ICO. It doesn't have anything to do with blockchain, but it is inspired by these things. It is inspired by this decentralized movement, but it's about what the World Wide Web was to AOL. If blockchain is to AOL, then what Mark Nadal is doing with ERA is to what Tim Berners-Lee was doing with the World Wide Web, and what that was to things like AOL, those walled garden internets. I'm not anti-blockchain, but I think we need something more foundational, more fundamental to help us out in the decentralized movement, which if you're interested in freedom, if you're interested in, self-governance, if you're interested in having control over your choices, I think you'll really like what they're doing over at ERA, because freeism it's not an ideology, it's just a methodology for freedom. And you can use it however you like. And may the best ideology win.